Can you hear me? Yes.
Sehr schön. Hallo.
Also die erste Information schon vorneweg.
First of all, Emiliano Chaimite cannot be here today due to illness. However, we're happy to have him here via video conference. He's joining us from Dresden. I suggest that we could start. Welcome to a panel this afternoon. Our title is Tension Between Solidarity, Populism and Racism, and How to Protect the Migration Society and Support the Progress of Social Cohesion. My name is Elias Steinheber. I work at the DeZIM Institute, the German Institute for Migration and Research, and I'm happy to be the moderator today. As the title suggests, we would like to use the following 90 minutes to take a look at how the migration society is under pressure from different sides, from racism and from anti-migrationist narratives. And we would also like to look at what the approaches are and what the approaches to resistance from the civil society is. So democratic societies, migration societies under pressure is not an exclusively German topic. So I am all the more happy to have people joining us today who will bring in perspectives from the US as well, so to have a transatlantic dialogue. I would like to introduce the guests, starting with Emiliano Chaimite. Emiliano has been working for decades in different contexts in migration policy making. He was the executive director of several migration organizations in Saxony. He is also active for the Social Democratic Party in Dresden at a communal level, at a municipal level, and there are few people who can really tell us what the migration society looks like in practice and what kind of resistance we can, as a civil society, to that pressure that we're under, do. So, Emiliano, thank you for joining us today.
Und wir haben auf dem Podium zu Gast Katharina Obser.
Here on the panel, Katharina Obser is with me. She is the head of the democracy program at the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Foundation in Washington, D.C. Before, she worked for the Women's Refugee Commission for Women's Rights First. Katharina has several years of very practical experience in civil society contexts, and she can give us insights into the steps that were taken back in the past few decades, but also what kind of resistance is forming in the U.S. Against the Trump administration and restrictions. Before we start, a few remarks. Katharina has a German last name. She understands German quite well, but she feels more comfortable speaking in English, which is why we will have a mix of German and English here in the panel. The questions will be asked in German, but Katharina will be responding in English. So if you do not understand English, feel free to grab some headsets, and you can also feel free to ask questions in English and German later on. This afternoon should give room for exchange. We have a free seat here, which isn't reserved for Emiliano. However, we would like to ask you to enter into dialogue. First of all, we will start with the panel, and later on we will open the discussion. If you have any questions in between, however, feel free to step onto the podium and participate.
Genau, dann würde ich sagen, legen wir direkt inhaltlich.
So with that, I think we can start. Emiliano, the first question, and we would like to use the first round to take stock and look at what important developments were in the restriction of migration policymaking.
Jetzt hört es auf. Auf die Migrationsgesellschaft, Emiliano.
Attacks on the migration society. Emiliano, in your view,
demokratische Grundfesten in Gefahr.
From which side do you believe is the democratic and migration society being attacked? And what are the developments of the past 10 years? What repercussions do they have on the one hand for people with a migration background and for people who are showing solidarity? Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be part of this event. I would have loved to come to Berlin. I was looking forward to doing some networking because there are so many interesting participants. And in times of a very cold climate in society, it would have been lovely to be able to exchange face-to-face. And I am still happy to participate online. And I will try to give a summary of my experiences as best as I can. Of course, it's difficult to take stock of these 10 years in such a short amount of time. But we do know that there is a certain situation prevalent. And I do believe that for an expert audience, this could be of interest. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them later on. I would like to talk about the past 10 years, as suggests the title, but we need to mention that the migration society has a certain tradition in Germany. You will notice that I do have two perspectives. One perspective from the East, a perspective from Saxony, because I have been living in Saxony for quite some time, and this is where I'm active, even though I'm well connected to other parts of the country. Of course, the situation in East Germany is sometimes a little different, and I will talk about that. I will focus on that perspective and not solely on the perspective of the entire country. In 1990, the so-called baseball bat years was a difficult situation. For migrants in East Germany, the situation was catastrophical, and this sometimes isn't mentioned enough in discourse today. We gathered strength. The civil society also showed solidarity. And we were given funds. We were supported also by policymakers to talk about this topic, migration, integration. And now we're not only talking about migration and integration, but also about democracy. Migrants who had been targeted, stigmatized, now can say that they are fighting for human rights, not for special treatment, but rather for human rights, which is quite basic. It is a struggle for democracy, a struggle of the whole of society, because democracy defines human rights. So we are led by human rights. Our struggle is led by human rights.
Möglichkeiten, über Vereine, Parteien, ist ja von der Vorstellung
parties, associations that I have worked in, and you introduced me as also being part of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party.
Institutionen hinweg hat die
are
Gesellschaft
finding ways
dieser erste, für mich persönlich erfahrbare
to act and to counter these crises like the one that I just mentioned, to overcome these challenges. So we are happy to have overcome these challenges, to overcome reunification. Migrants who in the beginning basically had no rights until they could stay and until they could also network and become connected to guest workers. These migrants were then, and the guest workers were then finally also recognized as being citizens on an equal footing. The GDR treated us as guests who were not supposed to stay. They wanted workers, and who came were people, and people stayed. So the perspective, the approach was, well, once the contract runs out and the reunification process is done, we can just send them home. And what we can see is that this was not achieved, otherwise I wouldn't be here today. The political situation of deportation without integration into the labor market and racism and so on. All of these, the struggle had to be fought together with the civil society organizations, with the church, and so on. 10 years. Well, in the Federal Republic of Germany, for 10 years now, we have been talking about migration. Before that, the Federal Republic of Germany used to say, we are not a country of migrants, of migration. And people are closely listening, especially in the East. They closely listen to politicians and which terms are used. When 2015 came along, and there was an influx of migrants, of refugees, suddenly the narrative changed, and it was said that, well, we do want migration, we do want to educate the public about the importance of migration, we want to hire skilled workers. The narrative changed.
Die Wirtschaft und viele Wissenschaft ignoriert, als sie gesagt haben, wir brauchen den Gestaltung zuwandern, wir müssen die Zuwanderung gestalten.
Researchers were ignored. Researchers that had said we need migration because the demographic change is well underway, and so we need skilled workers. So we can see that the demographic change plays a large role. Especially in East Germany, we have a large many people are leaving East Germany, and so there are targeted measures for migration. Hoyerswerda, for example, a small city in the coal region, coal mining region, is, for example, trying to hire skilled workers because they have such a high loss in population.
Und das ist immer eine auch der Probleme, die mit uns sozusagen lenken.
So these are one of the issues that we need to look into. And then 2015 came along,
wir brauchen Fachkräfte und jetzt lassen wir die rein.
And suddenly it was said, well, we are a country for migrants, we are letting them all in, and now we're taking a more kind approach. Well, of course, it was quite naive. I have to say that.
Wir sind jetzt so überrollt von Ereignissen und wir müssten da irgendwie zu überleben und gestalten wissen. Es entstand
because it was overwhelming. Only through so much solidarity from the side, from civil society, from several alliances, people who took action and supported us, were we able to achieve what we achieved. Many municipalities looked for creative solutions.
Programme, Integrationsprogramme, plötzlich waren Möglichkeiten,
There were integration programs, there were classes, integration classes,
die Menschen in den Arbeitsmarkt zu bringen. Das sind alles
and efforts to integrate people into society and into the labor market, more specifically. However, the municipalities were quite overwhelmed because they had been weak in the first place. The infrastructure was weak, especially when it comes to education and healthcare. The structures were so overburdened that, of course, this led to criticism, just criticism, where the municipality said, well, we cannot go on anymore, we need to find a solution. And of course, there was no magic solution. Many volunteers also started to become overburdened and overwhelmed. There were fewer resources. People were unsatisfied. They did not achieve what they wanted to achieve. And that is normal. These movements at such a large scale, if they fail in that way, this is what happens. And then suddenly Merkel said, we will manage this. And of course, there were a few people who really asked themselves, well, those are mere words. We also need to walk the walk.
Der dann tatsächlich mit wieder starken bestimmte sehr konservative rechtskonservative Kräfte.
Of course, there was a backlash, and there were right-wing conservative powers who used the situation
verschwörerische Theorien bedient worden ist und in der heutigen Zeit
disseminate conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism, and also through social media.
Und immer zunehmende Druck auf die Zivilgesellschaft, neben den Ressourcen natürlich auch den Populismus.
And that then exerted pressure on civil society.
Hier ihre Ämter dann einfach niederlegen, weil es einfach nicht weitergeht, hier im Osten noch schlimmer.
On policymakers, politicians, people who were active before, who don't dare to go out anymore and take action. We had social workers that used to give out their mobile phones and their personal contact details in order to be reachable, just to simplify the entire process. And this is not the case anymore because no employee would like to be so public with their contact details. They are under constant pressure and a target. I'll leave it up to the moderator to maybe also help me, well, with regards to the time. Well, Emiliano, thank you so much. Also, thank you for expanding the time frame, because we're clinging on to those 10 years, but it's important to recognize that these structures are much older than that, and thank you for also mentioning 1990. You said that, of course, at the moment, the situation is becoming more and more dire. You talked about local politicians being under pressure. The panel this morning also talked about that, even though you weren't there. So thank you for chiming in. I would like to include Katharina. So we're going to switch over to the transatlantic perspective. Katharina, you have been working in the United States for many, many years, and to many people, we like to look to the U.S. when it comes to democracy being under attack, because we see it as a prophecy. So I would like to ask you, what are the important milestones when it comes to this pressure on democracy? Well, I will start in English, and then I'll switch to... I will start in German, and then I'll switch to English. I came to the U.S. as a child, so I'm not there to hold my entire talk in German, and I'll probably mix the two languages at some point as well. And now,
so the question of the threats to a diverse and migration-oriented democratic society in the United States, I think there are three really important things in the United States. There is a language, and they're very similar to what's happening here. There is a language of criminalization and of crisis that has turned migration into something to be feared. There are very real socioeconomic pressures on large parts of the US population that have made migrants very easy scapegoats. So the grievances are real, and the reason for the grievance is not. And third, in the United States, immigration policy and law has completely failed to stay up to date with the reality of migration to the United States and with the reality of global displacement around the world today. We have, I think everyone actually, this might be one of the very few areas where people agree across the political spectrum would say the immigration system in the United States is broken, and it has been broken for a very long time. And because it is broken, it causes more chaos, and the right has taken advantage of the chaos. And this is where we are today. But I also am going to try to give you a history of immigration policy in the US over the past 10 to 15 years, and I will try to do it in a short amount of time, but I don't know if I'll succeed. So in the 1990s, a series of very restrictive immigration laws were passed in the United States, and they had a very big impact, which is that prior to this moment, you had a lot of circular migration. You had people who would come to the United States to work, and then they would go back home and sort of go back and forth. But with the much more harsh punishments that came with this new set of immigration laws, people no longer felt they could go home. So they came to the United States, they stayed, they brought their families, they created families, and what resulted was, probably unintentionally, a significant growth in the undocumented population in the United States from that time on. If we move forward to about 2013, 2014, a couple of more things happened. So Obama was president, and it's really hard to even remember this, but I worked very closely on this at the time. There was a very huge effort in Congress to pass what was called comprehensive immigration reform. This would have overhauled the immigration laws of the United States. It would have thrown a lot of money at border security, although compared to today, these numbers are now very small. But it would have created an actual path to citizenship for people who now had been living in the United States for a very long time. And it passed overwhelmingly in the US Senate, but in the House of Representatives, and for very political reasons, Republicans would not let it pass. They had the votes, but they would not let it pass. And again, this is sort of the start of the crisis, the growth of the crisis narrative. At the same time, the number of people arriving at the southern border in the US began to increase. And so the numbers compared to today were very small, but at that time it was the largest increase we had seen in a long time. And there was a big shift that happened. Before, we used to see a lot of men arrive, a lot of single men who were coming for work. And now we were starting to see families and women and children arrive from Central America who were fleeing very real fears of persecution. And the Obama administration responded to this with deterrence. They said, we will build detention, we will deport people quickly, and basically Obama's whole strategy was to say, look, I promise I will secure the border, I promise, and in exchange we will help people who are already in the US today. And we saw the beginning of what happens when you negotiate with a party that will not negotiate back in good faith. And Obama deported more people from the United States than any president had deported before him. And he could have deported every person in the United States, and Republicans would have said it is not enough. But this is where we were in about 2014. And then we get to 2015. So now I'm actually at the 10-year mark. And Trump becomes the candidate, and Trump points to Europe and says, look at what's happening in Europe. They are being overrun, and this will happen to us. And Obama, for all of what I just said, Obama was actually trying to bring in a lot of Syrian refugees to the United States as well. The US had a very strong history of refugee resettlement, of bringing in people who had already fled an initial country, who were now waiting for permanent resettlement. And Obama tried to increase those numbers to 100,000 at the time, even more actually. And Trump pointed to this as the source of everyone's problems. He added all immigration, whether asylum, refugee, labor migration, other migration, into one category and said, these people are criminals. They will come and attack us. We are under threat. They will take your jobs, and they will take your benefits. And this was a very, very potent recipe in the United States. And where we go from there, and the other thing you have to remember is, in the United States, we already have a very weak social security net, right? It's not like in other places. And so to tell people who are struggling economically, who have no social safety net, these people will come and they will get benefits, but you will not, is a very powerful thing to do. Then Trump is elected, and we have these big, horrible things that happen, the refugee ban, the Muslim ban, families are separated at the border. I worked very closely on this. It is one of the most horrible, I actually can't even talk about it. It's one of the most horrible things I've ever worked on. But behind the scenes, you also had a dismantling of the US immigration infrastructure that wasn't as public. You had civil servants who, I mean, not at the scale as we have today, but even then, civil servants who are being reorganized. You have forms that are being rewritten so that they are impossible to fill out. You make people afraid to come forward and ask for the benefits that they should get. And all of these things were already happening. It laid the foundation to where we are today. And by the end of the Trump administration, the demographics shifted again, and now we were starting to see more people from countries like Haiti or Venezuela. And again, this is part of the global story of global displacement. And at the end of the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, who is Trump's infamous advisor on all things immigration and now even more, used a very old public health law that had not been used before to shut down the border to all people seeking asylum altogether. And say, because this was when COVID-19 was, when Corona was happening, and he shut down the border. And that is what Biden inherited. And what happened under Biden is Biden sort of didn't know what to do on immigration. He tried to undo a lot of what Trump did, but at least when it came to the border, the Republicans were thrilled to keep talking about the border. Biden did not want to talk about the border, and so the Republicans controlled the narrative throughout this entire time. And if there is one thing that's been very clear through all of the messaging work, and I'm sure it's here too, is that what people want is to know there's an orderly system and that everything will be taken care of, that there's not chaos. And instead, the chaos narrative continues to thrive. And so Biden did try to do a lot of things, but it was not enough. And the right attacked in every way that they could. You had things like the governor of Texas busing migrants to democratic cities in the north to cause chaos and to cause political instability. And to some extent, it actually worked. And maybe later I will talk about how great those cities are actually doing on the ground. But I'll just should I end on where we are today for just one more minute? So this is where we are today. So Trump gets reelected. And now we have truly the most unprecedented immigration enforcement system in the history of the United States. The bill that passed this summer gives more money to immigration enforcement infrastructure in the United States than any military in the world except for the United States and China. We are now detaining up to 60,000 people a day, when a few years ago it was 30,000, and the numbers will go up to over 100,000. People are being pulled off the streets. They are essentially being kidnapped. The US Supreme Court has said that racial profiling is acceptable. So you can be, if you are the wrong skin color, if you speak the wrong language, if you do the wrong job, if you're a construction worker, that is enough reason to arrest you and ask questions later. And it's something that we've seen. I've seen this in my own neighborhood in Washington, D.C. as part of the takeover in Washington, D.C. So this is where we are today. Maybe I'll stop here because I've talked for a long time. And answer questions.
Vielen Dank, Katharina, auch nochmal für
Thank you very much, Katharina, for this comprehensive story showing that there were continuities even under democratic administrations. Restrictions were developed. And so we are not just talking about the German context, and not about a marginal problem or a sudden appearance of right-wing forces. We're talking about societal developments that came a long time developing. You already talked about the current developments in Germany. We also saw the pictures of Los Angeles, where ICE raids took place. People were arrested right in the street and were deported. Can you tell us what the current situation is, what happened on the ground in recent months?
So what's happening in June, in response to immigration raids in Los Angeles, there started to be more resistance. We are seeing people who are saying this is not okay. They are protesting. And in response to these protests, President Trump called in the National Guard. The National Guard is a little bit of I don't know how familiar people are with this. It's sort of like a reserve citizen army in the United States that each state has. And it's really meant to help with disaster response, or it can be federalized for actual conflict, international conflict. It is not meant to be used against U.S. populations. It's legally complicated, but only in very rare circumstances. So Trump did this against the will of the California governor, who of course is the person in charge of the National Guard of California. And that case went through the courts, and while that is still going through the courts, most basically one judge has said this was essentially illegal, that Trump should not have done this. But what has happened since is we have seen this model grow to other cities in the United States. So in August, this time using crime, just ordinary crime as a context, as a pretext in Washington, D.C., Trump called in the National Guard in Washington, D.C., but he did something else very important. He essentially took over the Washington, D.C. Police Department and forced Washington, D.C. to start collaborating with immigration enforcement. These are two things that are meant to be separate. And as a result, we have seen in D.C. and now in Chicago and now in Portland, checkpoints be set up across the city. So if you are driving a pickup truck, a construction worker, and you happen to go one of these checkpoints, you will be stopped and you could be arrested right then and there. We have seen in my own neighborhood, it's a very diverse neighborhood. We have a lot of Central Americans. There is a beautiful elementary school 1 block from my apartment, and parents have been arrested on the way to the school as they're bringing their children to school. These are just a few examples. This is happening everywhere. Maybe the last one I'll give is in Chicago. Recently, there was a horrific example where, I can't believe I'm saying it. In the middle of the night, enforcement helicoptered over an apartment building at 1 in the morning, rappelled down from the helicopter, went into the apartment building, opened every apartment, destroyed people's apartments and belongings, took people on the streets and zip-tied them, including many U.S. citizens, although of course it shouldn't matter. No one should be treated this way. And these are the things that people are now protesting in the streets. And this is why Trump says, I have to send in the National Guard. And so we get into a cycle that is breaking down democracy before our eyes, and that is also normalizing having the military in the streets because of the levels of immigration enforcement we see.
Vielen Dank, Katharina. Ich schaue schon mal ins Publikum, ob
Thank you, Katharina. I would like to ask our audience, do you have any questions? We heard about many parallels, things that are similar both in the US and in Germany. What's at stake is very prominent. We see attacks against democracy coming from different directions. We have a very problematic discourse. We see reduction of funds. Emilio, you talked about that. We see a climate of fear. We see attacks. many different ways of attacking the system as such. I see the first question coming here, and I would like to hand over the mic to you for comments or questions. In the second round, we'd like to talk about the counter-strategies in spite of the pessimistic picture we have shown regarding the present situation.
Thank you so much. As someone who's also from the United States, an American-based sociologist, I actually wanted to connect some dots here and hopefully giving the audience more context about copycat laws and the dangers of like this far-right populism. As you're talking about the coming together, the collaboration of local police and immigration enforcement, I remember being in my last year of the PhD program when Arizona passed SB 1070, Show Me Your Paper State. And that was really the beginning of the Tea Party, right before even Donald Trump. So as I'm looking at the kind of across the world kind of far-right movements, all the ways in which, you know, racial immigration policies, they all borrow from each other. But kind of the blueprint of what we're seeing now in 25 was set in 2013. And how they copycat. So I kind of just want to see if we can kind of also connect that of I don't want to say the dangers, but the dangers of this kind of rhetoric, and that it doesn't happen overnight. It's the slow and quick erosion. And as you said, in the United States, when everybody's, even the middle class, is living paycheck to paycheck, including myself as an academic, what can we really, like, so I just wanted to talk a little about that, about these incremental ways in which these policies really work.
I think that's right. One really important thing about the U.S. immigration system is it is constitutionally at a federal level. So when Arizona did pass this law, the Supreme Court did eventually find it unconstitutional because you cannot have a state that's doing immigration enforcement. It must be federal. It must be a federal power. But I think talking about this buildup is correct. And one other thing that's very important to note, again, I know I've said his name, but Stephen Miller, who is the longtime advisor to President Trump in the first administration on issues of immigration, and now he has a much wider portfolio, is really the architect of all of this. He is a person who is obsessed with the idea of negative net migration. He wants unquestionably for there to be fewer immigrants in the United States. He is the one who calls the Department of Homeland Security on a daily basis and says, what are the numbers? He is the one who has said there must be at least 3,000 people, I think 3,000 people a day, 1 million. He wants 1 million people deported per year. And what's interesting is that after the Trump administration left power the first time, Stephen Miller and, of course, many others spent 4 years preparing exactly for this moment. So they have carefully figured out every part of the law, every part of the bureaucracy, every part of policy that can be manipulated, changed, exploited to do exactly what it is that they are doing. This was extremely carefully planned and thought through. And that is also something I really want to caution about, is that when you mix this rhetoric with an actual planning for how to execute it, you get what we have in the United States today.
Vielen Dank. Gibt es aktuell weitere Fragen?
Are there any other questions? If not, I would like to hand over to Emiliano once more. When we look at the current situation and also when we venture a glance into the future, you said, well, you don't really know how to say something positive about the future, but can you once again tell us what are the opportunities we have to stand shoulder to shoulder? In how far do you think we will be showing solidarity with each other? Thank you. My impression remains, and my pessimistic attitude also remains as it is, but still, I mean, we had this situation already in the 90s where we thought, my God, what is going to happen next? Everything is going to go down the drain, but we managed to sort of rally civil society, strengthen civil society. And we noticed if we all work together, we can make it happen. My hope, of course, is that people will understand that it isn't migration that is the danger, that it's not the migrants that are the problem. Migration is a form of movement that has existed always all around the world. And of course, we do have to see that there's also something like an internal migration that happens. Different countries, different people have different problems, and people must just understand that dealing with minorities and protecting minorities and their rights is not a nice to have, is not just a gift. It is something you give for the benefit of society at large, because if you don't give minorities their rights, you allow practices to develop that can turn against the population as such. Then there will be more problems also for queer people, for people with disabilities, minorities that don't speak the language that we speak, or that don't speak the language as we speak it. Once the stone sets rolling, things will deteriorate. We see it not only in the United States, we also see it in some of the European countries, and we also see it can happen quickly. Many people say we have our secure institutions. Something like that cannot happen here in Germany. But look at the United States, what's happening there. It's a democratic system, and all of the world, they thought it's the country of democracy. These checks and balances. But all of a sudden, you can't believe what you're seeing there. As a migration society and as a person who is active in migration policy, I always count on our natural allies, democratic parties, trade unions. We can have different opinions. Of course, there are also some populist forces, very conservative forces in trade unions or political parties, but still, we can talk to each other, we can negotiate things. Of course, you shouldn't do too much, just giving preferences to one single group. You really have to be very careful, and we have to negotiate and find a compromise. But I think majority of people understand it's not just about migration society. It's about society as a whole. It's a threat to democracy. And so we already see systems that are similar to the United States. We have political forces in Germany who say they would like to have the same over here. Now imagine, that would be the end of our democracy. My hope, and my last hope, is that we will defend democracy together. And how do we do that? Unfortunately, I must say, there's been a long time I had to spend on developing defenses for us. We invested into resources to be together. And the situation right now is that we have to continue this struggle. We do it on a local level. We find allies in the administrative organizations, in democratic parties. We also create constant places, spaces, and platforms to exchange our opinion and create common spaces. And of course, we also must know that there is a general tendency for people is to get isolated, to stay in their comfort zones, in social networks. And you even have situations where you meet somebody you haven't seen in a couple of months, and that person has changed his or her attitude. So we need a lot of education work, enlightenment, if you so wish. And we work here together with trade unions, parties, church institutions, religious institutions. And sometimes, of course, we get criticized harshly, but we really need the time to look at the real problems, the environment, and we need to work together to go against all these problems instead of just coming back to this racist, post-colonial, capitalist stereotype. I'm sorry, I have to do some capitalism bashing. We need to criticize it. We had all that already. It is not so bad to live peacefully, to respect the rights of others. We must explain that time and again. And we hope very much that the media will be on board, many institutions will be on board, instead of turning away from us. It is not enough to be in our echo chambers and say, yes, we would like to do something, but people, the grassroots people, those who see us every day, they want to know what can be done in our neighborhood. And they're just waiting for civil society to solve the issue on their own without any resources, without any support. Well, we cannot let this happen because the enemies of democracy, they get enough funding, and we are supposed to defend democracy just on a voluntary basis without getting any support. Here, I think the policy makers, politicians will understand that projects and programs will be financed. We need as much money for this effort as we need for getting fit for defense, military defense, and getting ready to stand up against military threats. That goes back to the beginning we had in the morning. We talked about migrantization in the morning, and there are fully fledged attacks against all of us. And the social problems, of course, are problems of society at large. Thank you very much.
About 2 years ago, there were mass protests in Germany as a reaction to the research that was done by the magazine Korrektiv, investigative journalism. In your opinion, how do you look at these protests from a Dresden perspective? Maybe in which way were they also lacking mobilization? Well, I am glad that the people back then showed that they do not approve of this type of stigmatization of people and of the targeting of people who are part of this society. I was happy to see that there were so many people out on the streets protesting. I think those who have the right to vote, of course, we should not forget those who cannot vote in this country, but those who can vote, those 70–80% who are not anti-democratic and who do not vote in that way, they were visible at that point in time. They raised their voice, and sometimes we don't see that in our everyday life. Many people are quiet, and I think this is something that needs to change as well. But this was a point in time where I said to myself, okay, things are possible, change is possible. What would have we needed? Well, we would have needed all democratic parties to participate and not only, in retrospect, talk about the protesters as Antifa people and crazy leftists. No, they were people, everyday people who protested these findings. So I think we would have needed the backing from those democratic parties. These are people who protested, who have families here, who participate actively in society. People who raise their voices and tell everyone, well, we are the majority, not you. And so if the narrative is constructed in such a way that this is only a fringe movement, if that's the narrative that is coming from the political parties, that is very dangerous, and I do believe that would have to change. I don't know if you can hear people clapping. Thank you, Emiliano.
Kommentar auf dem Podium. Den würde ich direkt.
We do have someone who would wish to comment here on the podium. Well, thank you. I don't think that the microphone is working.
Einfach weiterreden? Okay.
Okay, this one is working. I'll continue.
Ich rede weiter. Ich möchte den Begriff der Solidarität nochmal.
I would like to talk about solidarity.
Und frage mich, was ist damit eigentlich?
The term solidarity, and I would like to ask myself, what does it mean? Just to give you some context, I wrote a book. I read a book called Education on Solidarity, which was written in the 80s, and even though I do not fully agree with the content on the book, I think the idea is quite interesting to educate people on solidarity, that we can learn to become, to show solidarity. And there were two things that went through my mind. One of the things was everybody is the same, and the other thing is that everybody is completely different, and I do think both thoughts are correct, even though they seem to be completely contrary. Everybody has the same needs, but everybody has also different interests.
Alle Tendenzen, die entsolidarisieren, auflösen.
So with this, if I accept this and understand this, then I can very successfully counter all of these initiatives that are calling for desolidarization. I was listening earlier as to what happens in the US, the scapegoating, this desolidarization,
Antworten auf komplexe Fragen schafft.
Trying to give simple answers to very complex questions.
Rollen.
Just the idea that everyone in their different roles, when it comes to their age, to their status of education, their gender, live in an asymmetrical world, but this should not lead to desolidarization. So solidarity can be learned from cradle to the end of one's life. Because there are so many different roles that I play in a society, but I rely on many other people for my existence. This idea that everyone is responsible for their own success, I think, is quite dangerous. This leads to desolidarization.
Baut auf Vorleistungen so vieler Menschen.
That I was able to study. So my existence, as I have it today, is due to so many people who supported me. And there are so many other things in everyday life. The water that I have that comes from my tap, the house that I live in, can only exist because other people made an effort. Not just your parents and your grandparents. They're important, but that's not where solidarity should stop. You should think beyond that and expand that solidarity.
Danke.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank für diesen Kommentar.
Well, thank you so much for your comment and for daring to come on stage. Maybe you can also serve as an example, so please, if you would like to comment or ask questions, come up on stage and do so. So Emiliano and Katharina, would you like to comment on that? Otherwise, I would take another look at the transatlantic perspective and ask you, Katharina, in your opinion, in the past week, millions took to the streets. You talked about the sanctuary cities who try to counterbalance the developments. Maybe you could elaborate. What are the things that are working?
Thank you for the comments. I agree, focusing on this, what unites us instead of what divides us, is so important. I think this is really important in the United States as well. I think we've seen what happens if we try to break down into too many groups of people instead of acknowledging that everyone actually is facing the same issues, right? This is the thing that keeps coming out of the election sort of discussion, is it turns out everyone is just really upset about the economy. It doesn't matter who you are. I think in the United States, and I've been working on this issue for a very long time, we always talk about we have to shift the narrative. We have to shift the narrative to one of inclusion, to talking about solidarity, but I also want to just acknowledge that shifting the narrative is really hard. It's really, really hard. And the other side is very well coordinated, and they are very well funded, and it just feels like you are sort of walking against a very strong wind when you're trying to do this. And shifting the narrative also is not something that can just be imposed. It has to happen organically. And so I do think one of the things that's really important in the United States, actually before that I should say, we also need to make sure, and I appreciated the mayor's remarks this morning, that the media shifts its narrative, because the media also plays an important role here. And for a long time, the media has often echoed the negative narratives about migration, and I know this happens here too. But it is the same in the US, and we talk about the border and we hear languages like floods and waves, and it's never positive. It's only ever this negative crisis language. And that's another thing that desperately has to change. But I think where you begin to change it is at the local level. In the United States, one of the last projects I worked on in my last job before I came to the foundation was to look at how cities across the United States were responding to an increase in migrants coming to their cities. Again, this was partly because of this very strategic, coordinated busing of migrants from the border to Democratic-run cities to try to cause instability. And it was hard. I think exactly as was said this morning, so it was not easy to see what was a very quick rise in the number of migrants who needed support and needed it very quickly, and who, unlike sort of past groups of migrants where there was more of a diaspora to lean on, it didn't seem like this group of migrants had that, and so they needed shelter and legal support and food and medical care. And what cities are doing at a local level, it's very hard, but it's extraordinary, because they have to respond, just as we heard this morning. At the federal level, we can talk and we can debate and we can stop any efforts at legislation, but at the city level, cities have to respond. And while there are many critiques that I would say of some of the things that were happening in this immediate response, there was also just amazing collaboration between government officials and volunteers and legal service providers and the faith community and so many others. And I think that's where you begin to see a change in the narrative, is when people actually see, oh, we can do this, and this is working, and we should do this. And what we said in our report that we wrote at the time was this phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So by creating new systems to support migrants in these cities, you're also creating systems that support everybody. There are many communities in these cities who have been underserved for a very long time, and building new shelters helps them too, not just incoming migrants. In terms of sanctuary cities, just a note on that. So sanctuary city is not a specific legal term in the United States, but it generally references a city that has made the decision to say, we will not cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. There have been a lot of efforts in both Democratic and, this happened under Obama and Biden as much as under Republican administrations, to say that when someone is arrested by a local police, that information is shared with federal law enforcement, and that federal immigration enforcement would like just a few days to figure out if we would like to then take this person into immigration custody. And these cities have said, no, we are not going to do this. Because one, many courts have found it unconstitutional, but two, we all know that if you mix these two kinds of enforcement, people lose all trust in their local police. And I've seen this happen even just in the last few months in Washington, D.C., where all of a sudden, any police activity is now suspect. Everyone thinks, oh, it's another raid. Someone's being arrested who should not be arrested, because you can no longer trust in the police, who you're supposed to go to if you need help. And so police departments across the country know that if they work with immigration enforcement, people no longer report crimes, and everything is less safe. And this is why many cities have said, we are cities that welcome. We think migration is a good thing. We think it makes us stronger and a better society. And also, we think that working with federal immigration enforcement causes far more problems than it would ever be worth.
Ich schaue noch mal in die Runde. Gibt es Fragen aus dem Publikum?
I was wondering whether there are more questions from the audience. Well, okay, yes, so over to you.
Hallo erstmal zusammen.
Hello.
Gerne auch kurz vorstellen, dass wir wissen.
You can also briefly introduce yourself. Bodo Weber from the Transatlantic Think Tank, from a transatlantic think tank based here in Berlin. I work on migration policy, and I do have a transatlantic perspective as well. Just a quick question and a comment. Katharina, thank you so much for emphasizing that the migration policy in the US is something that has a long history, a long bipartisan history. We could add that border police and the paramilitarization of border police is also something that is well underway and has been so for a few decades, both under Republican and Democratic administrations. I think in the 1990s, there was such an incident. A paramilitary unit that was active in a border area of 200 miles, a case that is unfortunately quite unknown. And I think you can draw a line here, and you can draw a connection here to the European situation that we have here at the moment. BORTAC, that paramilitary unit, was also used in the cities during the Black Lives Matter protests. And there is a paramilitarization also of ICE. Coming back to the discussion on reception and the narratives on a migration society, Emiliano mentioned that the narrative of a German migration society that started on 2015 has to be differentiated. 2006 until 2010, there was a political consensus on Germany as a migration society.
Der nachhaltigen gesellschaftlichen Verankerung dieses politischen Konsenses, praktisch bevor das passiert.
And then this concept was anchored in society.
Praktisch die
in 2015,
dieses Narratives von der Einwanderungsgesellschaft,
this narrative was replaced by crisis and criminalization, in my opinion. So illegal migration, also by the media and by policymakers for internal affairs.
Transatlantisch. Die USA sind ja nun die Einwanderungsgesellschaft per se.
The US is the migration society that we know, and it's different from Germany in that case.
Der Einwanderungspolitik haben wir auch
parallel to the change in migration society and migration policy making, the discourse has shifted.
Eines weißen Ethnonationalismus, White Supremacies.
Trump with his white supremacist narrative is quite prominent. So I would like to ask you, what and how far the American perception of themselves is shifting, and how far does that have to do with a change in demographics, and also something that we can also see in Germany. This type of ideology that this was so successful with non-white voters when it came to Trump's the second election, where Trump was elected to president for a second time. Why was it this narrative, this ideology, so popular among these voters, among Black and Latino voters, for example? Katharina, that question was directed at you.
First of all, I just want to lift up, I think it is very important to talk about the paramilitary culture and outfitting of U.S. immigration and border enforcement. There is a culture there that has become singularly obsessed with we are the defenders of the country. I mean, it really, and this has been happening for a long time. I would say that I've traveled to the border many times across the U.S. southern border. I have talked to many agents in ICE detention facilities, and this is a cultural issue that keeps growing. And one of the things I should say, and then I will get to the question, one thing that makes me very pessimistic is, even if, let's say we have elections, let's say that Democrats come back into power, let's say there is a Democratic president after 2028, we have we have an infrastructure that was already inflated more than you can imagine, that is now, as I mentioned, funded at levels that are unthinkable. But we also will have a border and an immigration force that has explicitly recruited people who want to do this work of rappelling down from a helicopter fully masked and trying to kidnap people, right? And I'm not trying to praise ICE and CBP of 5 to 10 years ago, but there were many people in ICE and CBP, the interior and the border enforcement officials, who were there to sort of do law enforcement, but not to rappel down in masks and just zip-tie children in the middle of the night. And now we will have a force that is full of these people, and I don't know how we undo that. There were two questions. There was the question of the U.S. as a country of migration. We've always been a country of immigrants, and then the question around, what do you make of the fact that there are also many people who voted for Trump who themselves, I do think that I think that the narrative shift on the right has been very effective. I think it's very clear that the whole country of immigrants narrative started to fall apart into we like immigrants when they're the right immigrants, right? And we saw that with Trump even in 2015 in the election, and once he was president, where we talked about people coming from Norway as good, and we talked about people from, using language that I will not use here, right, as bad, and that has fractured, I think, many people's. It fractured. The foundation of a country of immigrants was already fractured, and the right has managed to really open that fracture very powerfully. So it's sort of like we're a nation of immigrants when it's convenient, but right now it's really not convenient because I don't have enough money and I don't have enough support. And that part is true. And so therefore, and I'm being told that these people are taking my jobs and my benefits, and they're all criminals, and I think that they need to leave. And so I think that it was already fractured, and now that fracture is becoming bigger. The second question, I think, has to do with the kind of sort of growth of populism we are seeing everywhere. People no longer trust in the government, and this was also this was an effective strategy by Republicans to break trust in the US government once Obama came into power. And they no longer see government working for them. This was also said by the mayor this morning. And if this breakdown in trust continues, people will not vote for the same thing that was there before. They want to vote for change. And here's this man who says, I will fix this. I will fix the cost of eggs. This was one of the big things in the US election, was the cost of eggs at the grocery store. And so I think there are a lot of people who said, you may think that I'm voting based on my identity as an immigrant, but no, the most important thing to me is I can't afford eggs at the grocery store. And of course, what they got was something very different than they imagined. So maybe I'll stop there.
Vielen Dank, Katharina. Wir haben eine weitere Frage. Bitte auch kurz vorstellen.
We have another question. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Ich bin Elias Dehn von
I'm Elias Dehn from the Kindernothilfe. I do advocacy work for this Child Charity Foundation. I'd like to come back to the topic of changing narratives. We live in a country where the Federal Ministry of the Interior already talks about the mood in the country as a reason for conducting a very right-wing policy. So we, as civil society, we must start working at the grassroots where hostile strategies start emerging. And that is why we carried out a TikTok campaign with Xenon, a psychosocial center in Berlin working with refugees. And we developed a campaign saying, let the young migrants, the young refugees speak for themselves. What do they think about the German policy? What does it mean for a young person from Afghanistan or Syria when they learn that people are being pushed back at the border? Or what does it mean for them if all of a sudden they learn they cannot bring their families? And so this change of perspective works. I need refugees, that is the name of this campaign, because on TikTok you've got so many people who instigate to hatred, and that is why we need to be more active, especially on TikTok. Thank you for mentioning this, and I think we still have 10 minutes or so, and we do have another question. I'll take this question and then hand over for a final statement of our two speakers. Good afternoon, can you hear me? I am Susanne Rabe. I come from no organization at all. I work as a teacher of Protestant religion. And for me, the topic flight migration is a very important topic that I talk to my pupils about. Let me come back to what the previous speaker said. I'd like to return to Germany, and sometimes it's hard for me to be silent. And I'm looking for arguments, and what can I say? I was at the Baltic Sea this summer, and I talked to many people there. And there are many people that obviously vote for AfD, and I heard so many things from them. And so maybe a TikTok campaign is a good thing to do. What I heard about is this social hatred. We work all day and they get all the benefits without doing anything. And I'm very much concerned about, and here I also think that the idea of the social campaign is so good. It's the media. Sometimes I wonder, where are the facts? Where is the rational discourse? But in contrast to the United States, I do think we still have a chance to improve the situation. And of course, I hope for the US to get better soon. But we still have more opportunities to prevent things from deteriorating completely. Thank you for this optimistic outlook. I'd like to hand back to the two of you once again, Emiliano and Katharina. What is your take-home message, your lesson learned from this panel? I think we heard about so many parallels between our two countries, the United States and Germany. We also heard a lot about what, in spite of all the things, we can do to be active, relearning solidarity. That was one remark we heard. Let me come back to you, Emiliano. What is your practical experience? How can we learn solidarity? What is your take-home message, having participated in this panel? Thank you. Also, thank you for the great statements from our audience. It really shows that the things that I talked about are important, that we must get together in order to think about counter strategies. Thank you for mentioning all of that. And yes, young people. It's the young people we need. Social media activity, that is also something we need. And solidarity. Solidarity is not just a word. There was a writer who has defined solidarity, meaning we are all the same, but we are also different. And that is a word that we don't use too often, because solidarity sometimes is just equal to socialism, and solidarity is oftentimes seen just a word that concerns trade unions and socialists. Of course, in East Germany, the word solidarity was used with a different meaning, but solidarity is important today. We need solidarity in families, groups of friends, whole neighborhoods. And this solidarity must be something that we can take for granted, that we can all rely on. And of course, there were also good proposals regarding social media campaigns and working with young peoples. So let us rediscover the word solidarity, because without this general approach of solidarity, we won't be able to make it. Although we have our specific, very different interests, we must have a sense of solidarity. We do have some short-lived campaigns. But we've seen during the election campaign of Trump that there were so many supporters who thought, well, we can support Trump. He won't do anything against us. But he did, after all. I was wondering, what are these people doing? This will end not well for them. So you should always live your values, walk the talk. But there is this danger that some of the migrants forget their own migrant biography. They supported Trump because they think, well, I have worked hard, I live here, and nothing will happen to me, but we will fight against other migrants. This is a lack of solidarity. Only people that have no sense of solidarity would show envy. And this is the hope that I have. And this is my lesson learned during this panel. Be more active on the ground. And I have seen there are people who are active, who do something. And you also said something about the panels this morning that also focused on the same things that I feel concerned about. And that strengthens me for the work that I'm doing. Of course, I'm enthusiastic again. Of course, I can say, yes, we are on the right track. And I'm going to continue this fight. And I hope very much that we will have the opportunity to meet many times during conferences. Of course, people talk about the media and the attacks on the media. In the old days, they were so lopsided, so one-sided in their coverage. And then they noticed, after the attacks of the right-wing forces, they understood well what it means to be the scapegoats. They just thought that it's the black people, it's the Muslims that will be called the scapegoats by the right-wing movements. Now it's even the media. And now that they notice these attacks or feel these attacks, they act differently. And the media hardly ever got any solidarity. And some journalists now think about their work twice. Think about whether they should focus on the migration course, and that's also a problem if the media self-censors. Thank you. Emiliano, Katharina, how about you? What is your message? You already said you learned something this morning. What is your take-home message from this panel?
I love Emiliano's idea of funding the defense of democracy. And I would say that especially here, when you still can, this is very, very important. I think we don't pay enough attention to this. I think that in the US, there are still a lot of lessons to be learned about what we can do today in this moment. But I think thinking about it as a project to be defended and to be funded is critical. So I just really agree with that so much. I also really love I don't know where they went, the TikTok campaign. I think we've seen in the US the impact that can have, maybe not yet on migration, but if you see, for example, the campaign of the New York City mayor candidate, Zoran Mamdani, his whole campaign has been on social media, and he is connecting with people and resonating with people. And he also is focusing, again, on what are the issues that everybody cares about. New York City is unaffordable. Everyone can agree that New York City is unaffordable. And so I think focusing on these things and not only sort of the, well, this group of people over here or this group of people over here is really important. Maybe one other final thing that I would say is that was also said by Dr. Jung this morning. The federal support cannot be overstated. I think we would have had a very different situation in the United States if the federal government had actually supported cities in what they were trying to do. And of course, that wasn't going to happen, and for a number of reasons, but especially because Republicans would have never let it happen. Republicans are thriving on the chaos that has been caused. But if we actually had coordination and federal support, I think that the crisis, I personally don't like a crisis narrative anyways, but to the extent that it still exists, it would be toned down quite a lot. And I think that is very important as well. So maybe I will leave it there. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Katharina.
Thank you, Katharina.
Wir kommen zum Schluss.
We will now wind up this panel. We have 2 more minutes to go, and hopefully we were able to show you what is at stake, and hopefully we were able to show you how much it means to show courage and an attitude. We talked about bridge narratives, local networks. Emiliano, let me quote you. We need to use our platforms as platforms of empowerment so that we are not alone in our struggle. Thank you for all your wonderful comments and ideas from the floor. We will continue in 15 minutes from now, but first of all, we'll have a short coffee break. Thank you.